At 4:40 in the afternoon on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the lobby of a 6-story office building in Ashford Landing, Ohio, held only a handful of people, and 3 of them decided to look somewhere else. Everyone else in that building had gone home by 2. The woman behind the front desk was 28. White blouse still tucked in, green work vest still buttoned, ponytail coming loose the way it always did around hour 9 of an 11-hour shift, and she'd taken the holiday shift because holiday pay was time and a half, and she needed every dollar of it. Then the revolving door stuck the way it always stuck, and a man shoved it hard enough to rattle the glass. 30 years old, beat-up leather bomber jacket dark across the shoulders from the sleet outside, a heavy silver ring on his right hand. He didn't need a badge. The security guard buzzed him through without even looking up. He put a folded letter on her desk. She read 4 words of it and pushed it back. He didn't shout. He walked around the counter, took a fistful of her work vest at the collar, backed her against the edge of the desk, and said it slowly, close to her face, the way a man says a thing he's said before and gotten away with. "Don't forget who I am." The janitor, 71 years old, 22 years on that floor, gripped his mop handle until his knuckles went white, and then he turned toward the elevators. The office manager stepped out of the elevator on the 2nd floor overlooking the lobby with her coat already on, saw exactly what was happening, stepped back inside, and pressed the button for the parking garage. That soft click was the loudest sound in the room, and in a chair at the far end of the lobby, a man in a charcoal wool overcoat set down the contract he'd been reading. He set it down gently. 34. No tie, no jewelry except a wristwatch that had stopped at 9:40 and hadn't moved in 30 years. His shoes had been resoled 3 times. 4 rows behind him, 2 men in dark suits sat with nothing in their hands, reading nothing, waiting for nothing. And when he stood up, both of them stood up too. He lifted 2 fingers. They sat back down. He hadn't said a word yet, and 2 grown men had already returned to their seats. The man in the bomber jacket never saw him coming. He should have, because that afternoon, in that same room, 2 men laid claim to the same sentence. One of them had to shout it. The other one never needed to say it out loud. If this story moves you, give it a like so it reaches someone who needs it. Share it with a friend who still believes decent people stand up. And subscribe, because we tell one of these every week. Now let's go back to that lobby and find out what happened when the quietest man in the room finally decided to stand. 3 hours earlier, the building had still been filled with human voices. Then, by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it emptied very quickly. The way an office building always empties before a long holiday, one group at a time, everyone saying goodbye with the same words and no one truly listening to the answer. Adeline remained behind the reception desk, listening as the revolving door turned steadily, and then less and less often, listening as the elevators traveled up and down until they too fell silent. And when the only sound left in the lobby was the soft hum of the heating system above the ceiling, she knew her real shift had only just begun. The name badge on her chest bore the surname Vance. It was her mother's name. No one in this building had ever asked why, though in truth, no one ever asked her anything except whether elevator number 2 had been repaired and what time the conference room on the 5th floor would be available. For 3 years, she had carried that name to work every day like a coat that didn't fit. And whenever someone called those 2 syllables loudly down the hallway, she still needed half a second to remember that they were calling her. The desk phone rang shortly before 3 o'clock. It wasn't a business call. The woman from the nursing home spoke in a voice trained to carry no emotion, saying that this month's payment was overdue, that they understood it was the holiday season and everything was difficult, and that they only wanted to remind her. Adeline said she knew. She said she would arrange it by the end of the following week. The woman on the other end thanked her, wished her a happy holiday, and hung up. Adeline kept the receiver pressed to her ear for a little while after the line had gone silent, for no reason at all, except that putting it down meant returning to the number inside her head, and that number had never agreed to become any smaller. She had calculated it over and over since the beginning of the month. Holiday shifts paid 1.5 times her usual wage. If she worked the entire afternoon today, and all day tomorrow, she could make up part of it. If she gave up the rental car this month and took the bus instead, she could make up a little more. She hadn't yet found an answer for what remained, but she had learned that the remainder always found a way to present itself, usually at 3 o'clock in the morning, when she lay staring at the ceiling and counted the things she had lost in chronological order. Just before 4 o'clock, her cell phone vibrated inside the drawer. She knew who it was before she looked at the screen, because only one person remained in her life who called at this hour. Her grandmother called every week, and every week she asked the same question in the same voice, as though that question were the only thing left intact in her mind, after everything else had quietly drifted away. She asked whether her son had come home yet. Adeline closed her eyes. She had answered that question so many times that the answer no longer passed through thought. It traveled straight from her chest to her lips, worn smooth, softened, tested across enough afternoons that no sharp edge remained to hurt anyone. She said, "Soon, Grandma." She said, "Dad still has a little work to finish. He asked me to tell you he'll be home." The other end of the line remained silent for a moment. Then her grandmother laughed, the small, contented laugh of someone who had just been given good news, and said that in that case, she would wait. She said she would save him some dinner. Then she asked whether Adeline had eaten, and Adeline said she had, even though the only thing on her desk was a cup of coffee that had been cold since noon. When the call ended, she sat motionless for a very long time, still holding the phone, her eyes fixed on the revolving door beyond the desk as it turned slowly in the wind. Outside, the rain had begun changing into wet sleet, not cold enough to settle on the ground. She opened the drawer to put her phone away. Inside was a stack of unused company envelopes, and beneath them lay a small black memory card. It didn't belong to this building. It didn't belong to her either, not exactly. Adeline looked at it for precisely 2 seconds, no longer, then pushed the stack of envelopes over it and closed the drawer. She had repeated that gesture every day for several weeks, so regularly that it had become a habit. And like every habit repeated for too long, she had forgotten that it had begun with fear. The clock on the wall showed a little after 4. She pulled down her sleeves, straightened the name badge on her chest, the badge bearing a surname that wasn't her father's, and sat up straight like someone preparing to receive an important guest, even though there was no one left to receive anywhere in that building with 6 floors. The car pulled over at the curb in front of the building, and the man in the back seat didn't get out immediately. Gio Tremonti turned off the engine, glanced into the rearview mirror, and said this should have waited until the following week. No one in the world went to sign documents on the afternoon before a holiday, and even the attorney representing the other side had asked twice whether he had heard correctly. Emmett Castellano said he wanted it finished before the holiday. Gio asked why there was such a hurry, and Emmett replied that some things became easier to destroy the longer they were left alone, because more people had time to think of a way to do it. He had already waited 3 years, and he didn't intend to wait another week, simply because everyone was busy roasting turkeys. Gio laughed, then asked what sounded like an idle question. "How much did you end up paying for this place?" Emmett looked through the window at the brass plaque mounted on the building's facade, its corners darkened with tarnish, and said he didn't remember. Gio asked if he was joking. Emmett said no, he truly didn't remember, and told Gio to ask the finance department. Gio said, "I am the finance department." Emmett replied, "Then you already know," opened the car door, and stepped outside. For a moment, Gio remained alone in the car, and thought, not for the first time, that people believed power lay in how much a person possessed, when in truth, it lay in no longer needing to remember how much one had. Emmett crossed the sidewalk through the heavy, wet sleet, the 2 sides of his charcoal wool coat hanging open. The shoes on his feet had been resoled 3 times by the same cobbler on a street corner, a man whose work Gio had told him long ago to leave behind. Emmett never had. He had offered only one explanation. "These shoes know the way home." Gio hadn't asked again. The revolving door caught when Emmett pushed it, so he pushed a little more. Not hard, only enough. Then he stepped into the lobby. What he did next took no more than 2 breaths, and even if someone had been watching, they wouldn't have understood what he was doing. His eyes moved from the emergency exit on the left to the darkness behind the row of waiting room chairs, then up to the ceiling, where 3 camera housings had been mounted at equal distances, then down to the floor, where a trail of water ran from the entrance to the foot of the stairwell, and finally to the reception desk. Done. He knew how many exits the room had, where its blind spots were, and where the only person still inside was sitting. It was the habit of a man who had lived nearly his entire life in a world governed by its own laws no one ever put on paper, and he had carried them with him through 3 years of trying to leave that world behind, the way people carry the accent of their birthplace no matter how far they travel. He approached the desk. The woman behind it looked up. She asked if he was there to sign the contract, and said the others had already gone up to the conference room on the 6th floor. Then she asked whether he would like some coffee. She had just made a fresh pot, and it was still hot. Emmett said, No, thank you. He spoke in an ordinary voice, placing no emphasis anywhere, and it was the same answer he had given to strangers for decades. But the woman behind the desk paused. Then, almost as though she were speaking to herself rather than to him, she said, "You're the first person who has thanked me today." As soon as the words left her mouth, color rose faintly in her face. She looked down and began rearranging the stack of papers in front of her, as though trying to erase what she had just said. Then she told him to go straight up, using the elevator on the right, and said she would let them know he was coming. Emmett didn't leave immediately. He raised his eyes and looked at her. It was the first time he truly saw her, not as someone sitting in a room his eyes had just surveyed, but as a human being. What he saw was a young woman sitting with her back very straight in an empty building on the afternoon before a holiday, while all across America, people were making their way home. He saw the dark circles beneath her eyes that the thin layer of makeup couldn't conceal. He saw her own cup of coffee sitting to her left, cold and still nearly full. On his left wrist, his old watch remained motionless, as it did every day. Its hands stopped at 9:40, where they had remained for 30 years, and he had never taken it to be repaired. He gave her a single nod, then turned toward the elevator, not knowing that in less than an hour, he would have to return to this exact place. At 20 to 5, the revolving door caught again, and this time the person pushing it wasn't gentle. Adeline heard the glass shutter before she could look up, and by the time she did, it was already too late because Cade Brannock was inside the lobby. Denny Kirkwood sat behind the security desk, one hand still resting on the keyboard, his eyes still fixed on the monitor, and his finger pressed the interior release button with the certainty of a man who had done it so many times that he no longer needed to look. He didn't raise his head. He didn't look toward the reception desk either. Cade brushed the beads of wet snow from the shoulders of his leather coat, stepped across the trail of water on the floor, and the first thing he did was smile. He asked how she was. He asked how her grandmother had been lately, whether she was eating, whether she was sleeping. He asked in the voice of an old acquaintance who had stopped by to say hello, and Adeline felt both her hands turn cold. She said she was on duty, and if he needed to see someone, everyone in the building had been gone since 2 o'clock. Cade said he didn't need to see anyone. He said he had come to see her. Then he took a sheet of paper folded in half from inside his coat, placed it on the counter, and slowly pushed it toward her with the tips of 2 fingers, the way someone might move a piece across a chessboard. Adeline looked down. At the top of the page was the nursing home's logo, the same logo she had seen hundreds of times on the monthly bills, and directly beneath it was a line concerning a review of the long-term care agreement. She had read only the first few words when she understood, and she pushed the paper back toward him. Cade didn't take it. He left it where it was between them and said, in the same gentle voice, that he thought she should read all of it. He said the best part was at the bottom of the page. He said several members of the board were named there, including one name she saw every day on the brass plaque mounted outside the front of the very building where she was sitting. He asked whether she knew how long that man had served on the board. Then he answered his own question. Longer than her grandmother had lived there. Adeline said nothing. Cade leaned forward, rested both elbows on the counter, and lowered his voice as though he were about to share something private. He said that 3 weeks earlier, someone had seen her in the records room on the 3rd floor at 7 o'clock in the evening. He said the room was secured by an access card, and a reception card couldn't open it, so she must have asked someone for help, borrowed someone else's card for a while, or found another way. He said he didn't care how she had done it. What he cared about was what she had photographed, and whom she intended to give it to. Adeline said she didn't understand what he was talking about. Cade nodded slowly, pretending to agree, then said that was exactly what he liked about her. She always answered so calmly. For 3 years, she had sat behind that desk without revealing anything even once, and if he had been anyone else, he might have believed her. Then he straightened, and added that she needed to understand he hadn't come there to demand anything from her. He had come to help her understand one simple thing. It was this. A 79-year-old woman who could no longer remember what day of the week it was, lay in a room whose payment for that month hadn't been made, and with a single signature from one man on the board, that room could be given to someone else. He said it would be completely legal. He said no one would have done anything wrong. He said he was merely describing how the world worked, because it seemed that no one had taken the trouble to sit down and explain it to her in a very long time. The lobby was so quiet that Adeline could hear the heating system above the ceiling. At the far end of the room, the man in the wool coat had come back down from the 6th floor and was sitting among the waiting room chairs with a stack of papers on his lap. Adeline didn't look in his direction because she had learned long ago that looking toward someone at a moment like this only made things worse for both of them. Cade didn't look either. He tapped 2 fingers lightly against the paper still lying on the counter and told her to keep it, read it carefully, and think about it during the holiday. It was a holiday, after all. Time was one thing she wouldn't be short of. Adeline looked at the paper lying between them for another moment, then reached out and pushed it toward him, more slowly this time, sliding it all the way across the counter until it touched his hand. She said she didn't need to think about it during the holiday. She said she had already spent 3 years thinking. Then she spoke the words she had swallowed every day since the morning someone called to tell her that her father hadn't survived the previous night in the infirmary of a prison 2 hours from home. She said the company had needed someone to take the blame, and they had chosen her father because he was the gentlest man in the room and the only one who had no one standing behind him. She said they had taken her family's house, taken her father's name, and even taken away their right to remember him as an ordinary human being, because now, whenever anyone mentioned him, what they remembered wasn't the man he had been, but the brief line printed in the local newspaper. Her voice wasn't loud. She said they had already taken everything, and now they intended to take the room of a 79-year-old woman as well. Then she asked him when it would finally be enough. Cade listened to all of it, his head tilted slightly, wearing the expression of a man who was genuinely paying attention. Then he laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had just heard a child say something very funny while wearing an entirely serious expression. He asked what she thought she had been doing for the past 3 years. He asked whether she had ever wondered why a company that had just gone through a scandal like that, one the local newspaper had covered for half a month, would hire a woman of 25 to sit at the reception desk directly beside the entrance, exactly where all the mail passed, exactly where she could see who went up and who came down every day. He asked whether she had ever found it strange that in 3 years, no one had transferred her to another department or cut even one of her shifts, although she was the youngest employee there and had no one protecting her. Adeline didn't answer. Cade said Mr. Dunmore had known who she was from the day she submitted her application. He said her application had sat on Dunmore's desk for a single morning, and by noon, he had ordered them to hire her. He said Dunmore had given one additional instruction: don't let her sit anywhere out of sight. Then Cade delivered his final sentence in a voice that was almost kind. He said that during the 3 years she had believed she was searching for the truth about Dunmore, he had actually been sitting on the 6th floor, passing her desk every morning, knowing exactly where she was. He said she hadn't been overlooked, she had been kept. Adeline heard a ringing in her ears. Inside her mind, the past 3 years suddenly rearranged themselves into a different order, and everything she had once believed was luck, patience, or her own cleverness now revealed itself as a trail of stones that someone else had placed in advance for her to follow. The nights she had stayed late without anyone asking why. The access card for the 3rd floor that she had borrowed so easily she had nearly sighed with relief. The records room where she had stood for almost an hour without a single person knocking on the door. She stood there behind the reception desk in an empty building, and for the first time in 3 years, she understood that she had never been outside the trap. Cade picked up the paper, folded it in half along its original crease, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He said, "All right, Adeline." He called her by her first name in that familiar way, the name her coworkers used every day. Then he paused. He looked at her, and one corner of his mouth lifted slightly. He continued, "No, I should use your full name, shouldn't I?" Then he spoke the surname, her father's surname, the name she had hidden away for 3 years, believing no one in this building still knew it. He pronounced it very clearly, neither quickly nor slowly. Then he stepped around the end of the counter. There was a very brief silence in that lobby, so brief that when people were asked about it later, no one could remember how long it had lasted. Perhaps only a few seconds, perhaps less, but during those few seconds, 4 people in the room were thinking, and that was the one thing no camera could record. Herschel Otway stood about 10 paces from the reception desk, both hands still wrapped around the handle of his mop, and he wasn't thinking about the young woman across the room. He was thinking about a sheet of paper in the desk drawer at home, the paper stating clearly that once an employee had completed the required years of service, he would receive his full benefits. Herschel had counted toward that threshold one winter at a time, beginning when his wife was still alive, counting through the years when the building changed owners twice, and he remained because he knew where every water pipe in the building ran. Now he had only a few months left. He had repeated that number in his mind so many times that it was no longer a number. It was a door, and he was standing directly in front of it. And he knew that all it would take was one person on the 6th floor saying a single sentence for that door to close, and his entire lifetime of work to mean nothing. He told himself this would pass. He told himself he had seen things like this several times before, and every one of them had passed. He told himself that as he turned toward the elevators, and he knew perfectly well that he was lying to himself, and still he turned away. On the 2nd floor, Marlene Tibbs stepped out of the elevator with her coat already on and her car keys in her hand, and she saw everything. She thought about the 2 tuition bills lying on top of the refrigerator at home, both due in January, each bearing the name of one of her children, one in the final year and the other in the 3rd year at 2 different colleges. She had already calculated it. If she lost her job at her age, she wouldn't find another place that paid this much within 50 miles. She thought about how easily someone could be dismissed without any reason at all, simply by writing a few words about restructuring the position. She thought about how only a few more years remained before both her children graduated. Only a few years. And if she stepped out of the elevator now, she wouldn't have those years. Her finger pressed the button before she could give it permission to do so, and the doors closed. Throughout the descent to the parking garage, she stared at the seam where the 2 doors met, and told herself she would forget this before she reached home. She was wrong. At the security desk, Denny Kirkwood didn't take his eyes from the monitor, and there was no image in his mind, only a number. That number was the amount he still owed, and the man who held that debt stood less than 30 feet away. Denny knew how that kind of debt worked. It never demanded everything at once. It collected a little at a time, and each time, it demanded something smaller than money. A button pressed, a door opened, one evening spent looking the other way, and each time, the amount written beside his name grew a little smaller, while the true debt pulled him one layer deeper. He knew exactly what he was doing. That was the worst part. And behind the reception desk, Adeline didn't think about calling for help because she had considered that possibility a long time ago and had already reached the end of it. She thought about who would listen if she cried out now. The security guard had just pressed the button to open the door. The department manager had just gone down to the parking garage. The custodian was standing with his back turned. The police would eventually arrive, write a report, ask whether anyone had witnessed what happened, and no one would raise a hand. And on the 6th floor was a man who had known who she was for 3 years and had still allowed her to remain seated in this exact place. She thought about her grandmother waiting with a plate of dinner set aside for a man who would never come home again. Then she stopped thinking. On the first step, the stone floor made no sound beneath the sole of his shoe, and Emmett Castellano thought of the smell of cloth. He didn't choose to think of it. It came on its own, as it had come for so many years, always when he wasn't prepared. The smell of freshly cut cotton, the smell of sewing machine oil, the heavy steam rising from industrial irons inside a basement workshop where his mother worked the afternoon shift, and where he used to sit on the lowest stair waiting for her because he was still too young to be left home alone. On the second step, he saw her standing beside her machine again. He saw a large man walking toward her from the far end of the workshop. He saw the sewing machines falling silent one by one until the only sound left in the entire room was the hiss of steam from an iron. On the third step, he counted the people standing there once more. He had counted them for 30 years, and the number had never changed. 9 people, 9 grown men and women standing no more than a few steps from his mother, still holding scissors, rulers, and spools of thread, and not one of them stepped forward. It wasn't because they were cruel. Emmett had understood that when he grew older, and understanding it had made the memory hurt even more. They had young children. They had rent to pay. They had perfectly decent reasons. On the 4th step, he reached the end of the counter. Cade turned around. He looked the man before him up and down, taking in the wool coat and the expressionless face, then asked who the hell he was to interfere. Emmett didn't answer that question. He said something else. He said that less than an hour ago, he had finished signing several documents on the 6th floor, and from the moment his pen touched those papers, he had become the man paying the wages of the guard who had just pressed the button to let Cade inside. Cade stood motionless for a moment. Then he turned his head toward the security desk. Denny Kirkwood was looking down. He didn't look at Cade, didn't look at Emmett, didn't look at anyone, and the lowering of his head said everything without requiring a single word, because if the man in the wool coat had been lying, Denny would have looked up. Emmett said, Take your hand off her." He spoke in the voice of a man reading the weather report, no louder and no softer, and there was no other sound in the lobby for his words to compete with. Cade laughed. He asked whether this man knew who was standing in front of him. He hadn't finished the sentence when something struck the edge of the counter with a dry, abrupt sound. Then came a broken breath. Then the scrape of a chair sliding across the stone floor. Adeline stepped backward, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, and when she looked down, Cade Brannock was sitting on the floor with his back against the base of the desk, one leg stretched out before him. The broad silver ring on his right hand tapped against the stone with a faint clattering sound, because that hand was trembling. Emmett wasn't standing close to him. He had moved back half a step, both arms resting at his sides, and he was looking at him. That was what kept Cade from moving. He had been looked at in every possible way throughout his life. People had regarded him with hatred, fear, and contempt, and he was accustomed to all of it. He lived on those looks. But this man wasn't looking at him in any of those ways. Emmett regarded him the way a craftsman might examine a chair, whose leg had just broken. His head slightly lowered, his eyes faintly narrowed, considering whether it was worth repairing, or whether it would be easier simply to throw it away. There was no anger in his gaze. There wasn't even any interest. And Cade, sitting on the cold stone floor of a building he had entered and left for 2 years, as though it belonged to him, suddenly understood something he had never been forced to understand before. Some people were dangerous not because of what they wanted to do to you, but because you meant absolutely nothing to them. Emmett turned toward Adeline. He didn't offer her his hand. He didn't step closer. He merely asked whether she was all right, and when she shook her head, he told her to sit down, to sit and breathe. She did. She lowered herself onto the chair that had slid away, placed both hands on her thighs, and realized she was breathing like someone who had run a very long distance. At the far end of the lobby, the 2 men in dark suits remained seated where Emmett had signaled them to stay, watching in silence. He took out his phone, pressed 3 numbers, and when someone answered, he gave the address of the building, said there had been an incident in the lobby, said no one was seriously injured, and ended the call. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood waiting with both hands resting in front of him, silent, and throughout the entire wait, he didn't say another word to the man sitting on the floor. The police car arrived about 10 minutes later, its rotating lights shining through the wet glass of the revolving door and spreading streaks of red and blue across the lobby ceiling. The first person inside was a young officer, with one hand already resting on his belt, and directly behind him came a woman with short salt and pepper hair. She was in no hurry and looked around as she walked. Adeline would later learn that her name was Gwen Halloran, and that she had been doing this work longer than Adeline had been alive. Cade Brannock scrambled up from the floor as soon as he heard the door, and his voice changed completely, becoming higher, hurried, and filled with pain. He said he had been attacked. He said he had only come inside to speak with an acquaintance when that man suddenly rushed at him. He pointed toward Emmett and repeated that there were cameras, that all they had to do was review the footage, and they would immediately see who was right and who was wrong. He said it with the absolute confidence of a man who had passed the security desk often enough to know that the company maintaining the system had disconnected the feed at noon to perform work during the holiday, and that it wouldn't be restored until Monday morning. The young officer went to the security desk. Denny Kirkwood turned the monitor toward him. The screen showed a black frame with a message reporting the loss of signal, and in the lower corner was a timestamp frozen at noon. The officer pressed several keys, then shook his head. Halloran didn't look at the screen. She looked at the edge of the counter, the chair that had been pushed out of place, the trail of water running from the door, and the cold cup of coffee sitting to the left of the woman in the chair. Then she looked at the collar of Adeline's vest, where the top button had been pulled out of the crisp line left by the iron. She asked whether anyone else in the building had witnessed what happened. Marlene Tibbs was called up from the parking garage. She arrived still holding her keys and still wearing her coat, and when questioned, she said she hadn't seen anything. She said she had gone down in the elevator at that exact moment. The doors had opened and then closed again. She had heard a noise, but she hadn't seen anyone do anything to anyone. She delivered the statement clearly, without stumbling, and after she finished, she stared down at the keys in her hand throughout the rest of the questioning. Herschel Otway was no longer in the lobby. They called him twice over the radio, and neither time did anyone answer. Then Halloran turned to Adeline. She asked whether Adeline wanted to make a statement. She asked in the voice of someone who had asked that question thousands of times and still hoped this time would be different. Adeline opened her mouth. What she saw in her mind wasn't what had just happened, but a sheet of paper bearing the nursing home's logo and a name at the bottom of the page, the same name mounted on the brass plaque outside the front of this building. She thought of the room with the window overlooking the parking lot, where an old woman was saving a plate of dinner for someone who would never come home again. Adeline closed her mouth. She said she had nothing to report. Halloran watched her for another moment, then nodded and wrote in her notebook. Without a complainant, there was no case. Cade was allowed to leave. He limped toward the exit, favoring one side, and before stepping through the revolving door, he turned and looked back at the reception desk without saying anything. Then, it was Emmett's turn. The young officer asked for identification. Emmett said he wasn't carrying any. The officer asked his name. Emmett didn't answer. The officer asked again, his voice harder this time, and Emmett remained where he was with both hands held in front of him, silent, his eyes looking straight ahead. He said nothing. He knew exactly what would happen if he spoke. That name would enter the report. The report would enter the system. And before Monday morning, the man on the 6th floor would know who had just purchased most of the shares in his company. Emmett had waited 3 years to reach this point. He wasn't going to lose it over one afternoon, so he chose silence and extended both hands in front of him, willingly and neatly, like a man carrying out something he had already planned. Adeline sprang to her feet. She said, "Wait." Halloran raised one hand to stop her, not roughly, merely holding it out, and told her to sit down. When they led Emmett toward the door, he didn't turn to look at anyone. The only people left in the lobby were the woman behind the counter, the security guard still sitting motionless, and the woman detective closing her notebook. Halloran remained there a moment longer, looking around the room. Then she said, almost to herself, "I saw all of it." She said, "But I can't write what I see. I can only write what people are willing to say." It wasn't fully light yet when they let him out. No charges had been filed. No one had come forward to make an accusation. And when the legal limit on how long they could hold him expired, they handed back his wool coat and told him he was free to go. Gio Tremonte had been waiting in the station parking lot since midnight, and when Emmett came through the doors, the first thing Gio did was open the rear door for him, and the second was say that he couldn't understand it. Gio said all Emmett had needed to do was give them one name, just one name, and within 15 minutes, someone would have come down, signed the papers, and had the cuffs taken off him right there. Gio said everyone in the entire state knew who to call. Emmett got into the car, pulled the door shut, and said that if he'd given them that name, then by Monday morning the man on the 6th floor would have known exactly who had just bought his company. He said giving up the name would have cost him his advantage, while sitting there had cost him one night, and he'd chosen to lose one night. Gio fell silent. He started the engine and asked if they were going home. Emmett said no. He told Gio to sit still, then took out his phone. The first call lasted less than half a minute. Emmett said only a few short sentences, and on the other end was the slightly hoarse voice of a man who had just been awakened, and the man answered with only 4 words. "Yes, Mr. Castellano." The second call lasted a little longer. This time it was a woman's voice, alert and clear, with the sound of a keyboard clicking somewhere behind her, and she asked one question about the timing before saying yes, then within 2 days. On the third call, the person on the other end hesitated. He asked if Emmett was sure, said the other man had connections fairly high up. Emmett didn't answer. The silence lasted long enough for Gio, sitting in the front seat, to feel the back of his neck turn cold. Then the voice on the other end said yes. "I understand." On the fourth call, the voice was younger, with traffic noise in the background, and the person said yes. "I'm leaving now." The fifth call was answered by an elderly man with a slow voice, and the old man said Emmett's father had asked him for one favor in his entire life, and he'd never forgotten it. And yes, he would do this. On the 6th call, the person who answered said it was only 4 o'clock in the morning in Chicago. Emmett said nothing at all. The other man cleared his throat, then said yes. "I'm getting up now." Emmett slipped the phone back into his coat pocket and rested his head against the seat. Gio watched him through the mirror, waiting for an explanation, but none came. All he managed to say was that Emmett had just woken up half the state at 4 o'clock in the morning because of a receptionist he'd spoken to for no more than 2 minutes. Emmett closed his eyes and told him to drive. By noon the next day, in a small town where hardly anything of consequence happened all year, 3 lawyers from 3 different cities had checked into hotels along the main street, and not one of them knew who the other 2 were, nor did any of them know exactly who was paying them. Adeline, meanwhile, received an automated email at 9 o'clock that morning, pre-scheduled by Human Resources. It was brief and polite, thanking her for her contributions during her time with the company and informing her that the receptionist position would be reorganized as part of restructuring, effective immediately. No one called her. No one offered any further explanation. She read the email 3 times, then sat for a very long while in her cold apartment, one hand still resting on the keyboard, thinking that at least they hadn't felt the need to invent a crueler reason. Near noon, the nursing home called. It was the same woman's voice from the day before, still trained to carry no emotion, and this time she said that Ruth Ann's care contract had been moved into pending review at the request of the board, that it was only a procedural matter, that nothing had changed yet, and that they would contact her again as soon as possible. Adeline asked who had made the request. The woman said she wasn't permitted to disclose that information. The next morning, when Adeline opened her door to leave for the bus stop, she found an unopened pastry box sitting on the front step. Beneath it was a piece of paper folded into quarters, handwritten, unsigned, with only one sentence saying that the writer had 2 children in college. There was no apology. Adeline carried the box inside, set it on the kitchen table, and didn't open it for many days. On the 3rd day of the holiday, Gio Tremonte sat in the small upstairs study of Emmett's house, with the stack of transfer files the seller had just delivered spread out in front of him, and he did what he always did after every acquisition, which was read from the last page backward. He did it because experience had taught him that people hid the worst things at the end. He went through the lease agreements, the equipment inventory, the list of employees still on payroll, and then stopped at the final section, the personnel decisions scheduled to take effect during the week of the transfer. There was a termination notice there, dated the day after that afternoon in the lobby, with the reason listed as position reorganization during restructuring. The employee's name was Adeline Vance, and at the bottom of the page, in the space reserved for the owner's representative, there was a signature. It wasn't Emmett's handwriting. It had been signed on his behalf under delegated authority, using the signature stamp every corporation relied on for hundreds of administrative documents each week, and legally it carried the same force as if he'd put pen to paper himself. Gio read it again to make sure. Then he opened the company's historical records, the file he'd barely glanced at because everyone assumed that section contained nothing but old business, and he found the civil case that had been closed 3 years earlier, found the name of the accountant who'd been convicted, and sat very still for a long time when he saw that surname. He went downstairs, placed the file on the table in front of Emmett, and pointed to 2 places. Emmett read them. He read slowly through the first time, then read them a second time, and throughout it all his expression didn't change, though the hand resting on the tabletop slowly closed. Gio said the company Emmett had just bought was the same company that had built the case against her father 3 years earlier. Gio said the decision terminating her, the decision sent at 9 o'clock the morning after Emmett had still been sitting in the station, carried the signature of the new ownership. Gio said that meant it carried Emmett's signature. Emmett said nothing for a long while. Then he asked how many people knew. Gio said no one yet, that the files had only arrived the day before. Emmett asked if she knew. Gio said she'd received only the email from Human Resources, and there hadn't been anyone's name in it. Emmett gave a very small nod, then stood and walked to the window, where he remained looking outside at the thin layer of snow settling over the cars parked along the street. He said that for 3 years he'd bought and bought again more things than he could count, in an effort to clean his name. And now it turned out he'd bought the very thing that had destroyed a family, bought it with clean money, signed for it with a legally valid signature, and become the new owner of that same machine in the very week it ground down the last person left in that household. Gio said he could reverse the termination first thing tomorrow. Emmett said reversing it was easy. He said once it was reversed, she'd go right back to sitting behind the same desk, in the same building, beneath the same people. And then he wouldn't have fixed anything at all. He'd only changed the hand holding the leash. The desk phone rang near dusk. Gio answered, listened, then handed the receiver over. On the other end was Rocco Castellano. His uncle's voice was as mild as ever, the same voice of a man accustomed to congratulating someone before saying what he'd really called to say. He asked after Emmett's health, asked how the holiday was going, then said he'd heard something in passing about what had happened at Ashford Landing. He said he wasn't asking for details, because asking for details wouldn't be proper. He only said that Emmett's father had once lived by a rule: never let the family name appear in places you couldn't control, and a building lobby with police coming and going was certainly one of those places. Then he added, still in that same even tone, that he knew Emmett was trying to change a great many things, and that was fine. But when things changed too quickly, the people inside the family didn't have time to understand, and when the people inside didn't understand, they began asking questions of one another. He said he was only telling him this because he cared about his nephew. Then he wished him good night and hung up. Emmett lowered the receiver and sat without moving. Gio asked what he wanted. Emmett said, "He just told me that he already knows." He came to see her that evening, after the snow had stopped and a thin skin of ice had formed across the road. Adeline's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building, with an exterior staircase running along the side. And when she opened the door, she recognized him at once, even though she'd spent the past several days thinking she would probably never see that man again. He didn't step inside. He stood out in the hallway with both hands in the pockets of his coat, and he said he only wanted to ask one question, then he would leave. Adeline remained in the doorway, blocking the entrance, and told him to ask. Emmett asked what she kept in the drawer. Adeline couldn't answer right away. She stood there with one hand still wrapped around the doorknob, and in her mind she saw that afternoon again, the moment she'd opened the drawer to put away her phone, then pushed the stack of envelopes over it to hide it, a gesture she'd made hundreds of times, and had believed no one in the world had ever noticed. She remembered where he'd been standing then. She remembered how he'd looked around the lobby for no more than 2 breaths before stopping, and she'd assumed he was only looking for the elevator. She asked if he'd seen it. Emmett said he had. Then he went on, saying he hadn't come to take it, and he hadn't come to ask what was inside, because he could already guess. He said what he'd come to tell her was this: that thing couldn't save her. It had been taken from a records room she wasn't authorized to enter, using a card that wasn't hers, outside working hours. Give it to a lawyer, and the lawyer would hand it back. Give it to the press, and the press would run a story, and 3 days later people would forget the story, while what remained would be a lawsuit with her name on the defendant's side. He told her to think about it. For weeks they'd known she had it. They'd known where she kept it. So why hadn't they taken it? He let the question hang for a moment in the cold air of the hallway, then answered it himself. They hadn't taken it because they didn't need to. He said they'd let her keep it. He said as long as she held on to it, they had something ready to use the day she did anything that caused them trouble. And that day had been the previous Wednesday afternoon. Adeline leaned back against the doorframe. She said that for 3 years she'd kept believing she was holding something in her hands. Emmett said she was holding the rope they'd already tied around her wrist. There was silence for a while. Then she began speaking. Not because she'd meant to, but because it had been too long since anyone had stood at her door willing to listen. She said her grandmother was in a nursing home. She said the old woman no longer remembered what day of the week it was. She said this month's room payment hadn't been made, and the contract had been moved into pending review. She said she'd just lost her job, and she said that every week her grandmother called and asked her the same question, and every week Adeline answered with the same lie. Emmett listened to all of it. Then he said something very simple. That he could take care of. Adeline shook her head. She said no. She told him not to pay it for her. Then she said the words he would remember for a very long time afterward, that she'd changed creditors once before, and her father had died because of it. She said her father had also once had someone step forward and say, "Let me take care of it." He too had once accepted a lifeline that looked exactly like kindness at the time, and by the time he understood that the lifeline had a rope attached to it, he'd already drifted too far from shore. She said she didn't want another person standing over her, even if that person was decent. Emmett didn't argue. He only nodded and said he understood. Then he said he'd once owed someone a debt he could never repay either, and he didn't say who that person was. He said goodnight and left. Adeline followed him as far as the end of the hallway, stood there watching until he'd gone all the way down the exterior stairs, and stepped into the car waiting at the curb. When she turned back inside, she glanced over the railing toward the hallway on the floor below, out of the habit of someone who lived alone. The row of lights down there had just gone dark. In the entire building that night, aside from her, no one else remained. Human Resources called her near the end of the week and said her personal belongings were still in the locker, and if she didn't come collect them before the first working day after the holiday, they would be moved into storage. The caller added that she could come on Sunday afternoon, when the building would be mostly empty, which would make things less uncomfortable for both sides. Adeline understood what that meant. She arrived a little before 4 o'clock, taking the bus, getting off at the corner, then walking around to the rear entrance because she didn't want to pass through those revolving doors again. Her access card had already been deactivated, but the garage door was still open from someone pressing the button inside, and a maintenance worker was pulling the trash bins out, so she followed him in. She took the stairs up to the first floor and emptied her locker. A sweater, a box of cold medicine, a ceramic mug with a chip in the handle, a small picture frame she'd turned face down a long time ago. She put everything into a paper bag. She didn't look toward the reception desk. On her way out, she went down through the parking garage because the exit to the main street required passing through the lobby. The garage on a Sunday afternoon was almost empty. There were perhaps 3 or 4 cars scattered along the row near the elevators, while the rest of the white-marked spaces lay bare beneath the lights. The lighting system down there worked on motion sensors, switching on when someone passed and shutting off again a few minutes later, and Adeline had been used to it for 3 years. She walked along the center lane with the paper bag held against her chest, and ahead of her the lights came on 1 row at a time. Somewhere near the middle of the garage, she heard footsteps. She stopped. The footsteps stopped too. She started walking again, and this time she heard it more clearly. Not a single set of steps, but her own footsteps and something else following half a beat behind. The kind of delay the human ear recognizes instantly, even before the mind has found a name for it. She didn't turn around. She walked faster, and behind her, the row of lights she'd just passed went dark exactly as it always did. Then the next row went dark too, and the darkness kept following her 1 section at a time. She remembered that the stairwell door was at the corner to the right, about 20 meters farther ahead. She counted silently in her head. The footsteps behind her weren't keeping their distance anymore. Adeline dropped the paper bag and ran. She heard someone call her name, calling her by her father's real surname, and she recognized the voice immediately. Then she heard a second set of footsteps from the other side of the line of concrete pillars, cutting across the route she was running toward. She swerved sharply between 2 parked cars, her heart pounding so hard that her ears began to ring, and at that exact moment, at the top of the ramp leading down into the garage, 2 sets of headlights came on at once. Inside the car, nearly an hour later, Gio Tremonte tore the medical tape with his teeth and wrapped the final turn around Emmett's forearm. He did it with the practiced movements of a man who'd done it many times before. The dome light was on, and the sharp smell of antiseptic filled the enclosed space. Emmett didn't look down at his arm even once. He sat with his head resting against the seat, his eyes fixed through the window, where in the distance the lights of another car could be seen carrying that woman home. He asked if she was all right. Gio said she was fine, just some scrapes on her knees, and their people had already taken her home. Emmett was silent for a moment, then asked again if she was all right. Gio looked up with a slight frown and repeated that she was fine. Emmett nodded. About a minute later, he asked a third time, almost as though speaking to himself, whether she was really all right. Gio let the roll of tape fall into his lap. He said, "Listen to me." He said that what happened this afternoon, in that entire company, only 3 people knew she was coming back to the building today. He named the first 2, both from Human Resources. Then he gave the third name, and that name didn't belong to anyone in the company, Rocco Castellano. After saying it, he stopped. He didn't add a word of explanation, and the car remained silent for a long time. Then Gio asked the question he'd been wanting to ask since the moment he'd slammed on the brakes at the top of the ramp. He asked how Emmett had gotten there so early. He said, "I was driving. I know exactly when we left, and I know you told me to head that way before anyone called you." He asked how Emmett had known she was there. Emmett didn't answer. He pulled the sleeve of his coat down until it covered the bandage completely, then told Gio to drive. Herschel Otway came one morning at the beginning of the week and stood at the foot of the exterior staircase of the building where Adeline lived, wearing a knit cap and holding an old paper envelope in one hand. He said he hadn't dared call ahead because he was afraid she wouldn't let him come up. Adeline made him a cup of tea, and he took it but didn't drink. He sat on the edge of the chair with his back straight and both hands resting on his knees, and he said he'd come to tell her something that, if he didn't say it now, he would carry with him to the grave. He said he was the one who had reported that she'd gone into the records room that night. Adeline set her cup down. Herschel didn't stop, because he knew that if he stopped, he wouldn't be able to continue. He said he was the one who locked up every floor each night, that he had keys to every door in that building, and that evening, when he passed the 3rd floor, he'd seen the light still on in the records room, and he'd seen her inside. He said he'd stood out in the hallway for nearly a minute, and in that 1 minute he'd thought of every possible thing. Then he'd gone downstairs and hadn't said a word to anyone. But 3 days later, the manager called him upstairs and asked him directly whether he'd seen anyone enter the records room after hours, and he'd answered. Adeline asked why. Herschel looked down at his hands. He said he'd worked in that building for nearly his entire working life, that he'd started there when his hair was still black and his wife was still alive, and he'd counted every single year toward the point when he would finally qualify for his full benefits. He said he only had a few months left. He said he knew that milestone sounded small, that it sounded like nothing compared with what had happened to her. But at his age, it was everything he had left, and when the manager asked him that question, he'd seen that milestone standing right in front of him, and he'd answered before he even had time to think. Then he added, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, that this was also why he'd turned his back that afternoon. He said people thought he was a coward. He said he wasn't. He said he hadn't dared look, because he knew he was the one who had pushed her to that place, and a man who had shoved someone into the water had no right to stand there watching them struggle to stay afloat. He placed the paper envelope on the table and pushed it toward her. Inside was a small memory card. He said that many years earlier, when tools kept disappearing from the maintenance room, he'd spent his own money on an old camera and mounted it on top of a storage cabinet, aimed through the crack of the door. It wasn't connected to the building system. It recorded only onto the card, and he changed the card every month. He said it pointed outward at an angle and captured one corner of the lobby, that the picture was very blurry and there was no sound, but he said it was clear enough to see the other man's hand. Then he stopped for a very long time, and he said it was also clear enough to see him standing there, holding a mop, without moving a single step. He said he'd watched that footage many times. He said he didn't watch the other man. He watched himself. That same week, at a small diner about half an hour's drive from town, Emmett Castellano sat across from Denny Kirkwood. Denny didn't deny a single thing. He stirred his coffee, shrugged, and said yes. He was the one who had pressed the button to open the door, and he'd done it not once but many times, and he said it in the careless voice of a man who had already decided he wasn't going to apologize to anyone. He said Emmett wanted to know why. Then fine, here it was. He was in debt, gambling debt. He'd owed it for 2 years, and that debt wasn't held by any bank. It was held by that man. He said every time he pressed that button, a little was taken off what he owed, and he knew perfectly well the debt would never truly disappear, and still he kept pressing it. He said Emmett could go ahead and despise him. Everyone else did. Emmett said nothing. Then Denny bent down, pulled a worn, hardbound ledger from his shoulder bag, and threw it onto the table, not handed it over, but threw it. He said the company still required security guards to keep handwritten shift logs, an old practice left over from the previous owners that nobody ever bothered reading, and at the end of each year the books were simply tossed into a box. He said he wrote everything down anyway. He said he recorded every single time that man had entered the building over the past 2 years, the time he came in, the time he left, and even the name of the person who called down to the security desk beforehand to say someone would be coming. He told Emmett to open it and see for himself. Emmett did. Page after page, year after year, the handwriting slanted, ugly, and careless, the times scribbled down in haste, and in the final column, every single time, there was only one name. Denny said he'd kept the records because he was afraid. He said he'd thought that if everything ever fell apart one day, at least he'd have this to save himself. Then he finished the last of his coffee, stood up, and said he'd never imagined there would come a day when it would save someone else. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of an old hotel on the main street, and at the busiest hour of the evening, there were only 2 plates set out, both on a table beside the window. Sterling Dunmore arrived 10 minutes late, took off his coat and handed it to the waiter, looked around the completely empty dining room, with its tables already laid with napkins, and not a single person seated at them, then sat down and asked why it was so quiet tonight, whether the entire town had gone away. Emmett said he liked quiet. He didn't add that the entire evening had already been paid for in full that afternoon. The whole dining room, the kitchen, even the waiter standing in the far corner with both hands clasped behind his back. Dunmore unfolded his napkin and laid it across his lap, then said he'd done some checking into the buyer. He said he hadn't found much, and that in itself said quite a lot. Then he got down to business. He said he was a practical man. He said what had happened in the lobby was unfortunate, that the young employee had behaved improperly and would never set foot in that building again. As for the elderly woman in the nursing home, He said one phone call would put her file back into normal status, and he'd even be willing to waive the overdue fees as a gesture of goodwill. And as for the girl, if she wanted her job back, she could have it. Or if she didn't, he could arrange what they would call transitional employment assistance. Entirely legitimate, with all the proper paperwork. Then he placed both hands on the table and said what he wanted in return. He said the audit the new ownership was requesting needed to stop. He said every company had old accounts that benefited no one when they were dug up, and Emmett was an owner now too, so digging into them meant digging into his own property. Emmett listened to everything without interrupting once. Then he asked whether Dunmore knew the accountant's name. Dunmore paused slightly. He said, of course he remembered. Emmett asked whether he knew where the man had died. Dunmore set down his knife and fork. He looked at Emmett for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The easy warmth of a man presenting merchandise was gone. He asked whether Emmett intended to lecture him about morality. Then he said the thing he'd been holding back since the beginning of the meal. He said he'd done business with Emmett's father for nearly 20 years. He said, "You think I don't know who you are? I've known since before you were old enough to sit at the table with the adults." He said Emmett was trying to wash the family name clean, and his sincere advice was that it couldn't be done. He said the family's money had been scattered throughout that town since before Emmett could read. It was buried beneath the floors of some of those warehouses outside. It was sitting in the books of half the companies still breathing, and every time Emmett turned over another page, somewhere on it he would find his own family signature. He said the only thing Emmett could choose wasn't whether a price would be paid, but who would pay it for him. Emmett sat still. For one very brief moment, his face failed him, and Dunmore saw it, and Dunmore knew he'd struck exactly where it hurt. Then Emmett said Dunmore was half right. He said the part he had right was that the name couldn't be washed clean, and Emmett had known that for a long time. The part he had wrong was thinking Emmett hadn't chosen yet. He said he'd already chosen. The one who would pay the price was him. Then, Emmett reached inside his coat, took out a thin stack of papers, folded in half, placed it on the table, and pushed it across. Dunmore didn't touch it. Emmett said it wasn't a file of criminal evidence. He said it was a list of everyone who had signed confidentiality agreements with Dunmore's company over the past 20 years, along with the current address of every one of them. He said they were all still alive. He said Dunmore hadn't done anything to them. He'd only bought their silence. And that was the difference between the two of them. Because Emmett understood that silence had an expiration date, and Dunmore didn't. He said every person on that list was waiting for exactly one thing, for someone else to be brave enough to step forward first. Then he stood, put on his coat, and left before the main course was served. The preliminary report from the auditing firm arrived Friday afternoon, more than 300 pages thick, and the section that made Gio Tremonte read it again and again was the chapter dealing with outgoing transfers during the period before Adeline's father was arrested. The money hadn't disappeared. It had moved through 3 intermediary companies, each of which existed for less than 2 years, and its final destination was a business registered as a logistics service company outside Cleveland, the kind of name anyone on the outside would have skimmed past without a second thought. Gio didn't skim past it. He knew that name. He'd seen it in the Castellano family books back when Emmett's father was still alive, and he knew exactly what it had been used for. He carried the file downstairs, placed it in front of Emmett, and opened it to the page containing the final 2 signatures. Those 2 transactions completed the entire chain. They had been dated 1 week apart. The signer was Emmett Castellano, barely 31 at the time, newly brought into the room by his father to learn the business, and he'd signed both documents on the same afternoon, at the bottom of a stack of papers his father had pushed across the desk and told him to sign. Emmett stared at his own signature for a very long time. It still carried the handwriting of his younger years, the E larger than the way he wrote it now. He didn't say a word. Adeline heard the news from one of the 3 lawyers staying in town. She came the following evening without warning, and when the door opened, she walked straight inside without waiting to be invited and threw a photocopied file onto the table. She asked if he'd read it. Emmett said he had. She asked if he intended to deny it. Emmett said no. Then he said the sentence he knew was meaningless the moment it left his mouth, that back then he hadn't known what he was signing. Adeline stood perfectly still. Then she laughed, a short, dry laugh, the kind that comes from someone hurting too badly to cry anymore. She said her father had said exactly the same thing. She said he'd said it in the interrogation room, said it again to his lawyer, and said it one final time in court, standing there with both hands on the table, saying he hadn't known what he was signing. She said no one had believed him. She said people liked to say that not knowing didn't make someone guilty, but they only said things like that to people who had enough money to hire someone else to say it for them. She said her father had been a salaried accountant in a small town, and when he'd said those words, the entire courtroom had gone quiet in the way people go quiet when they're hearing a defense they've already heard too many times before. Emmett said he knew. Adeline said he didn't. She said he'd signed 2 pieces of paper in one afternoon and then gone out to dinner, while her father had lost 41 months inside a place she was only allowed to visit once a month. She said he'd spent that money. She said he hadn't spent it directly. She knew that. But that money was in this house. It was in the car parked outside. It was in the 3 years he'd spent buying company after company, trying to clean his name. She said now he knew what he'd been using to clean it. Emmett didn't answer. He stood there with both hands hanging at his sides and let her say everything she needed to say. Then Adeline continued, and her voice changed. She said there was something else. She said that for the past several nights, every night there had been a car parked 2 blocks from her building, tucked away beyond the streetlights, and every night it was the same car. She said she'd thought she was becoming paranoid. She said that changed on Sunday afternoon in the garage, when 2 sets of headlights came on at exactly the right moment, and she was lying on the concrete floor, unable to catch her breath, wondering how anyone could have gotten there so quickly. She said it had taken her several days to understand. She asked him how long he'd had people following her. Emmett said since the night he'd been released from the station. Adeline nodded slowly, as though he'd simply confirmed something she'd already known. Then she asked whether he'd ever planned to ask her permission. Emmett said he'd been protecting her, and Adeline said the words that cut through everything. She said that man had said exactly the same thing. She said he'd stood outside her home for months. He'd known what time she left for work, what time she came home, who she went anywhere with. And every time she said anything about it, he'd told her he was only doing it because he worried about her, because the world outside was dangerous, because she should be grateful someone was watching over her. She asked if that sounded familiar. Emmett couldn't say anything. Adeline picked the file up from the table. She told him not to come again. She told him to call his people back. Then she said one final thing, more quietly, and it was the quietness that made it hurt. She said she'd spent her entire life living beneath someone else's watchful eyes, and she'd rather walk alone through the darkness than have to thank someone for watching her without asking permission. Then she left. The door closed behind her. Emmett remained standing in the same place for a very long time afterward. The lawyer told her on Monday morning, plainly and without trying to soften it, because he saw no point in letting her hold on to hope for another week. He said they'd managed to reconstruct the entire chain of money transfers, but all it proved was where the money had gone. It didn't prove that her father hadn't been the one who moved it. He said the crucial issue was the handful of documents bearing her father's signature, and the copies stored in the company's system were rescanned digital versions, which meant the signatures couldn't be forensically examined. He said they needed the originals, the paper copies, the ones with real ink on them. He said without those, everything they had in their hands was nothing more than a compelling story. Adeline asked where the originals were. He said, according to the records, they'd been destroyed under the document retention procedure 2 years earlier. She took the bus to the nursing home that afternoon because she didn't know anywhere else to go. She sat in the hallway for a long time before entering the room because she didn't want her grandmother to see her face the way it looked then. When she went inside, Ruth Ann was sitting beside the window with a blanket across her lap, and she turned, looked at her, and smiled the same smile she gave everyone who came through the door, the polite smile of someone who wasn't quite sure whether she knew this person but still wanted to be kind. Then her eyes brightened. She said, "You're here." Then she asked the question she always asked. She asked whether her son had come home yet. Adeline sat down on the edge of the bed, and she couldn't answer. This time she couldn't answer. She sat there holding her grandmother's hand, and for a long while all she could hear was the sound of her own breathing. Then she said, "Grandma, I'm so tired." She said, "I ruined everything." She said, "I've tried for 3 years. I kept Dad's name alive. I went to work in that exact place. I thought I was finally close, and now it turns out I haven't accomplished anything at all from the very beginning." Ruth Ann didn't understand everything she was saying. That much was clear. But she understood the voice. She lifted a hand and stroked Adeline's hair, a gesture she still hadn't forgotten, and she whispered, "Shh. It's all right, sweetheart." Then she turned slowly, and pulled the old handbag from the chair beside her into her lap. It was a leather bag faded at both corners, its strap replaced once with thread of a different color, and she hadn't let it out of her reach since the day she'd moved into the nursing home. She carried it with her when she went down to the dining room. She kept it beside her pillow while she slept. The staff had tried 3 times to take it away to be cleaned, and all 3 times she'd cried like a child, cried so hard that after the 3rd time they stopped trying altogether and wrote into her care notes that no one was to touch the bag. Everyone had assumed it was simply something old people did, that she clung to a keepsake because she'd already lost too many other things. She set the bag on her lap, opened it, then reached inside to the place where the fabric lining had come loose along the bottom and had been sewn shut again by hand, with large uneven stitches made by someone whose eyesight had grown poor. She searched for a while, then pulled out 2 envelopes. She handed them to Adeline. She said he told her to keep them. She said he'd told her that if anyone ever came asking, she should give them over. Then she added something else, and she said it so calmly that Adeline had to hear the words a second time in her own mind before she understood them. She said she'd kept them for 3 years, but nobody had ever come to ask her. Adeline took the 2 envelopes in trembling hands. The second one had nothing written on it except a small line of handwriting in one corner, and she set it down on the bed without reading it. She opened the first. Inside was a stack of paper documents, the originals, written in blue ink, some places slightly blurred from dampness but still intact, along with a small sheet of paper on which her father had handwritten the identification number of each document in order. Beneath the papers was an old handheld voice recorder, the kind that ran on AA batteries, its plastic casing yellowed with age. Adeline pressed play. The recording was only 14 seconds long. Her father's voice filled the small room, slightly distorted, slightly hurried, the voice of a man speaking from inside a car or perhaps some hallway somewhere. He said, "Addie, if you're hearing this, then things have gotten bad," he said. "I didn't take a single dollar." Then he paused for a beat and said, "I wasn't very brave either. I was scared." Then he said, "Remember to eat dinner. You always forget to eat dinner." And then it ended. Adeline sat on the edge of the bed in that little room, with its window overlooking the parking lot, and she thought about how, for 3 years, once every week, she'd sat in this exact place, while that bag had rested no more than 1 meter from her hand. The police had never asked her grandmother. The lawyers had never asked her grandmother. And she, his own daughter, had never asked her either, because she too, like everyone else, had decided long ago that an old woman who had forgotten almost everything was no longer someone worth asking. The Castellano family dinner was still held on the first Sunday of every month, at the old house that had belonged to Emmett's father, and the tradition had existed since before Emmett was born. The dining table was long, set in the center of the room, and every member of the family had a place of their own, a place no one ever spoke about but everyone understood, and where a person sat told everyone exactly where that person stood. That evening, everyone arrived and took their usual seats on time. There was only one thing different from all the dinners before it. To Emmett's left, the chair that had belonged to Rocco Castellano for decades was no longer there. It had been removed that afternoon, and the empty space had been closed by sliding the 2 neighboring chairs closer together, neatly, naturally, as if no one had ever sat there at all. Rocco arrived more than half an hour late. He came in, took off his coat, and walked straight toward his usual place out of a habit built over decades, then stopped. No one looked up. They kept eating, kept passing dishes from one person to the next, kept exchanging quiet remarks about the weather and the roads, and the entire room behaved as though the man who had just walked in were a stranger who had opened the wrong door. Emmett continued cutting the food on his plate without raising his head, and he told his uncle to sit down. Then he went on, still without looking up, and said on second thought, he could stand, because he wouldn't be staying long. Rocco stood there for a while. Then his voice broke loose. He asked whether Emmett knew what that house had been built on. He said Emmett's father had done things so there could be food on that table, so the people sitting there could attend schools their family once wouldn't even have dared dream about. He said Emmett sat there in an expensive coat, hiring auditors to dig through his own family's books, and then called it cleaning the name. He asked whether Emmett intended to sell the family name in exchange for a piece of paper proving that his taxes had been paid on time. Emmett set down his knife and fork. He did it very gently, without making a sound. And all along the length of the table, one person after another set down their own knife and fork as well, without anyone telling them to, and for several seconds the room became so quiet that the only sound was the heater clicking in the corner. Rocco looked around the table. Not one person looked back at him. Emmett raised his eyes. He said his uncle was right, that his father had built that house, but his father was dead, and Emmett wasn't. He said nothing was going to happen to Rocco, and he promised him that. No one would touch him. He could live wherever he wanted, and if he needed anything, all he had to do was ask. Then he said the final thing calmly, without raising his voice, that from that night forward, Rocco would never sit at that table again. Rocco opened his mouth as if he were about to say something. Then he looked around the table one more time, at the dozen or so faces lowered toward their plates, and he understood that this had been decided before he ever walked through the door. He picked up his coat and left. No one saw him out. When the outer door closed, Emmett picked up his knife and fork, and everyone at the table picked up theirs with him, and dinner continued. As for the company at Ashford Landing, Emmett didn't report anyone himself. He did something any person who had just spent money acquiring a majority stake in a company had every right to do, and often did, which was hire an independent auditing firm to review the complete financial records of the business he had just purchased for the previous 5 years. The auditing firm didn't know anyone in the town, owed nothing to anyone, and did exactly the work it had been paid to do. When its auditors discovered the chain of transfers through 3 intermediary companies and the documents showing signs of irregularities, they didn't ask the owner what he wanted them to do, because the law didn't allow them to ask. The law required them to report it, so they reported it. Gio read the copy of the notice that had been sent, set it down on the table, sat in silence for a while, then said Emmett hadn't reported the man. Emmett said no. He said all he had done was open the window. The stench belonged to the other man, but he didn't stop there. 3 days later, before anyone had time to turn the questions back toward him, Emmett signed a voluntary cooperation agreement with investigators and submitted the entire file relating to the logistics company outside Cleveland, including the final 2 transactions bearing his own signature. His lawyer tried to stop him twice. The lawyer said he wasn't required to submit that part. He said no one had asked about it yet. He said submitting it would mean opening a door that might never be closed again. Emmett said he knew. Then he signed. The trial opened on a morning near the end of winter at the county courthouse, and the courtroom wasn't as crowded as people had expected. The first person called to testify was Marlene Tibbs. No one in the room had expected her to be the one who opened the case, not even the prosecution, because in her original statement she'd said she hadn't seen anything. She walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on the cover of the book, and when she took the oath, everyone in the courtroom could hear her voice trembling. She said she'd lied in her statement. She said she'd seen everything. She described that afternoon, said she'd stepped out of the elevator on the 2nd floor, with her coat already on, said she'd clearly seen the man pinning the receptionist against the edge of the desk, and said she'd raised her hand and pressed the button to close the elevator doors. The opposing attorney asked why she was only speaking now. Marlene was silent for a long time. Then she said it was because she couldn't sleep. She said that for months she'd been waking up every night around 3 o'clock in the morning and hearing the sound of those elevator doors closing again inside her head. She said she had 2 children in college, said she'd thought about those 2 tuition bills in the exact second she pressed the button, and said she wasn't standing there asking anyone to forgive her. She only wanted to be able to sleep from now on. Then she added something that wasn't part of the question, but the court clerk recorded it anyway, that she'd left a box of pastries outside the girl's door, and she knew perfectly well that a box of pastries couldn't make up for anything. The second witness was Herschel Otway. He walked up slowly with the paper envelope in his hand and gave the memory card to the clerk before sitting down. He told them about the old camera he'd bought with his own money and mounted on top of the cabinet in the maintenance room. Said it wasn't connected to any system. Said the image was blurry and there was no sound, but it captured one corner of the lobby, and the timestamp on it was accurate. Then, when the prosecutor was about to thank him and dismiss him, Herschel said he hadn't finished. He said there was something else, and in front of the entire courtroom, he testified that he was the one who had reported that she'd entered the records room. He gave the date, the time, and even the name of the manager who had questioned him. One of the prosecution's own attorneys had to stand and remind him that he wasn't required to testify about that. Herschel said he knew. He said he'd worked in that building for nearly his entire working life, said he was only a few months away from qualifying for his full benefits, and said he understood that after today, those benefits would probably be gone. Then he said the sentence many people in that courtroom would remember long afterward, that he was 71 years old, and he didn't want to carry that afternoon with him into the grave. Denny Kirkwood didn't testify. He'd turned over the handwritten security log to the prosecution the week before, sending it by mail without a single note attached. And on the day of the trial, his seat remained empty. Some people said he'd moved to another state. No one knew for certain. Adeline was called last. During the recess beforehand, she sat alone in the hallway and took the second envelope from her bag, the one she'd brought home from the nursing home and hadn't dared open for weeks. In the corner of the envelope was a small line in her father's handwriting that said, "For whoever finds the truth." She opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter on graph paper, the kind sold in the prison commissary, and the handwriting was shakier than the writing on the sheet where he'd listed the document numbers. He hadn't written it to her. He'd written it to someone whose name he didn't know, someone he could only hope existed. He wrote that he didn't know who the person was. Maybe a police officer, maybe a lawyer, maybe simply someone who happened to read this. He wrote that he wasn't asking that person to clear his name, because he knew that by the time anyone read the letter, he would already be gone. And once a man was gone, having a clean name didn't do him much good. He asked only one thing. He asked that person to find his daughter and tell her that none of it was her fault. He wrote that she kept thinking she should have visited him more often, that every time she came she apologized for taking so long to come back. He wrote that she'd already come more than enough. He wrote that those visits were what had helped him survive more than another year in a place where he'd never thought he'd make it through even one winter. Adeline folded the letter closed. She sat in the hallway for a very long time, both hands resting on her lap, until someone came out and called her name. When she entered the courtroom and walked to the witness stand, she lifted her eyes and looked across the room. And in the very last row, against the wall, a man in a charcoal wool coat was sitting there. He didn't stand. He only sat with both hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, because this was her fight, and he knew he wasn't allowed to step into it. And Adeline, standing on the witness stand, suddenly understood that the person her father had written that letter to, the person whose name he'd never known and whose existence he'd only dared to hope for, was sitting in the last row of that courtroom. The verdict was handed down at the end of spring. Cade Brannick was charged with assault and extortion, and with the security shift log now entered into evidence, his claim that he'd merely happened to stop by could no longer hold together. Sterling Dunmore was charged with multiple offenses at once, including document forgery, falsification of records, and obstruction of justice, and his trial continued for many months afterward. Adeline's father's case was appealed through the retrial procedure, and on a quiet morning with no reporters present, the court overturned the old conviction and stated clearly that the accountant hadn't committed the crime for which he'd been blamed. Adeline received the ruling in the mail. She read it standing in her kitchen, never sitting down, then folded it and placed it in the drawer beside the old voice recorder. Outside the courtroom on the final day, as Cade was being led through the hallway, he saw the man in the wool coat standing at the far end, and he called after him, asking who he was, asking again and again, his voice breaking like that of a man who needed to know what he'd lost to. Emmett kept walking. He didn't turn around even once. The price came afterward, steadily, month by month. Gio spread the books across the table one evening in July and told him plainly that the company was now worth only a fraction of what it had once been, that 4 partners had withdrawn, that the voluntary investigation Emmett had signed on to cooperate with had lasted more than a year and still hadn't been closed, and that the armored car had been sold in the spring. Emmett listened to all of it. Then he asked only one question, whether there was still enough money to keep paying the benefits of the people who had already retired. Gio said there was. Emmett nodded and said then that was enough. Then another holiday season came, more than a year after that Wednesday afternoon. Ruth Ann had been moved to a smaller nursing home outside town, to a room with a window overlooking a row of maple trees, and the home had a pet therapy program with an old cat that was very carefully looked after and spent most afternoons stretched out in the sunlight on the windowsill. Ruth Ann would stroke its back and smile. That day, when Adeline walked into the room, her grandmother didn't ask the question she always asked. She looked at her for a moment, then called her by the right name, clearly and without hesitation, and said, "You're here, sweetheart. Come sit with me." Adeline had to turn toward the window for a while before she could speak. She'd finished the certification her father had left incomplete when he was young, had failed the final course twice before finally passing it, and now she worked at a small accounting office with 3 people on the main street. One evening every week, she taught a free introductory class to first-year students at the community college, all of them barely past 18, And before they left each night, she always told them the same thing, that someday, when they went to work and someone put a piece of paper in front of them and said, "Just sign it," they should read it first. Emmett, meanwhile, still went to the coffee shop across from the old building every Wednesday afternoon, ordered 1 cup, and sat at the table outside without speaking to anyone. He kept doing that for more than a year, until one afternoon in October, when he arrived and found someone already sitting there, with 2 cups waiting on the table. Adeline pushed one toward him and asked how long he planned to keep drinking alone. He sat down. He didn't order anything else, didn't make any decision for her without asking, and before he said another word, he asked whether she'd mind if he stayed. She said she wouldn't. They sat quietly for a while, watching people pass along the street. Then she said that for a long time, she'd thought he was the man who saved her. He said he wasn't. He said he'd only pulled that man's hands away from her, while every difficult part that came afterward, she'd done herself. She asked him, "Then who do you want me to remember you as?" Emmett shook his head. He said no. He didn't want her to remember who he was at all. He said he only wanted her to remember who she was. Then he pulled up his sleeve and held out his wrist. The old watch was still there, its glass still scratched exactly as before, but this time the second hand was moving, one small step after another, steady and even. He only said he'd taken it to be repaired the day before. He didn't explain anything else, and she didn't ask. This story leaves us with a few very simple things. A person's worth is never decided by the loudest person in the room, but by the way that person rises again after the days when it seemed there was nothing left to rise for. Remaining silent in the face of something wrong is also a way of helping it continue. But it's never too late to speak. Whether we're 71 or 45, no matter how many years we've already spent saying nothing. And a truly decent person doesn't save us by making us carry a debt of gratitude for the rest of our lives, but by giving us back the ability to stand on our own 2 feet. And never assume that because an old person has forgotten many things, they are no longer worth sitting beside and asking questions, because sometimes the most precious things in this world are being kept in the very hands we thought had grown too unsteady to hold anything anymore. If today's story made you think of something in your own life, please leave a comment below, because we sincerely want to hear what you feel deep in your heart. Please subscribe to the channel, press like, and share this video with the people you love, so that each day we can have another warm story to listen to together. We wish all of you good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.